The doctor had warned her that the stress alone should have stopped her heart, but Isolde Sterling had one more thing to do before she collapsed. She stood in the center of the Michelin-starred dining room, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches that fought against the constraints of her red velvet gown. Her hand was pressed hard against the swell of her 8th month of pregnancy, feeling the frantic, rhythmic thrum of her pulse, or perhaps it was the baby's. The elite of the city sat like statues around her, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting between the Duchess's tear-streaked face and the Duke's crumbling composure. "Isolde, darling, sit down," Dominic hissed, his voice a low vibration of aristocratic authority. "You're making a scene. You're not well. It's the hormones." He reached out his hand, the same hand that had signed his name to a betrayal, attempting to grab her arm. Beside him, Camille Laurent leaned back into the shadows of the booth, her hand over her mouth in a gesture of friend-like concern, though her eyes remained as cold and calculating as a predator watching a wounded animal. Isolde didn't sit. Instead, she withdrew a crumpled, tear-stained parchment from her clutch and smoothed it over the white linen tablecloth, right next to the puddle of spilled Merlot that looked disturbingly like blood. "The doctor said I was 5 minutes away from a total physical breakdown," Isolde whispered, her voice gaining a terrifying, melodic edge that silenced the entire room. "But I think the guests should hear the toast you really wanted to give tonight, Dominic." She looked directly into the lens of a socialite's smartphone at the next table, and then she began to read. "My dearest Camille," she started, the first words hitting the air like a gunshot. "Once the heir is born and the legal contract of the marriage is fulfilled, she will be discarded. The estate will be ours, and the nuisance of Isolde will be a memory." The sound of Dominic's wine glass shattering against the marble floor was the only response. The great Duke was no longer a man of power. He was a man caught in a lie that was about to cost him everything. The morning of the 10th anniversary didn't begin with the warmth of a husband's touch or the celebratory chime of crystal flutes. It began with the rhythmic, clinical clicking of a metal clipboard. Isolde Sterling sat at the edge of the sprawling mahogany bed, her body feeling like a heavy, gilded anchor in a sea of Egyptian cotton. The sunlight that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling estate was too bright, too surgical. It didn't warm the room. It only served to highlight the chilling perfection of a house that felt more like a museum than a home. Every pillow was chopped at a precise 45-degree angle. Every surface was dusted to a mirror shine. In this house, even the air felt curated, as if breathing too deeply might disturb the expensive silence. "The guest list for tonight's gala at El Eclat has been finalized, Your Grace. The press has been briefed to focus on the unshakable foundation of the Sterling Union." Isolde didn't need to look up to know who was speaking. Camille Laurent stood by the heavy oak door, framed by the long shadows of the hallway. She was a vision of sterile, minimalist perfection in a charcoal gray suit that whispered of efficiency and screamed of cold ambition. Camille wasn't just Dominic's executive assistant, she was the silent architect of the Sterling image. She was the woman who chose the lilies Isolde was supposed to love, the woman who drafted the anniversary cards Dominic signed without reading, and the woman who managed the nuisance of Isolde's life so the Duke didn't have to. "Thank you, Camille," Isolde said, her voice sounding thin and brittle like old parchment. "I assume the Duke is already in the study." "He has been working since 5, Camille replied, her eyes tracking the slight, involuntary movement of Isolde's hand as it moved to shield the 8th-month swell of her stomach. There was no warmth in Camille's gaze, only a cold, professional assessment, the way a mechanic might look at a machine that was nearing its production quota. "He requested that you wear the sterling sapphires tonight. He was quite specific. He wants the royal look for the cameras." "He wants the mask," Isolde thought, her heart giving a dull, heavy thud. Dominic didn't see a wife when he looked at her. He saw a legacy. He saw a strategic alliance and a vessel for the next Sterling heir. For 10 years, Isolde had lived in this glass cage, meticulously groomed and expertly displayed. She was the perfect duchess, the woman who remained silent during his outbursts and smiled during his absences. She had built her life around his shadow, believing that if she just held her breath long enough, The coldness between them would eventually thaw into something resembling love. Later that morning, the silence of the estate became a physical weight. Isolde found herself wandering the long gallery, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs. The walls were lined with portraits of previous sterling duchesses, women with high collars and higher cheekbones, all looking back at her with the same frozen, painted smiles. She felt like a new addition to the collection, a beautiful, silent object kept in a climate-controlled room to prevent decay. She stopped by the study door, her fingers trembling. She had intended to ask Dominic if they could skip the public spectacle, if they could, for once, just be a family. The heavy door was ajar, just a sliver of golden light spilling onto the hallway floor. "The timing has to be precise," she heard Dominic's voice, low and resonant. It wasn't his public voice, the one he used for charity galas. It was the sharp, predatory voice of a man closing a hostile takeover. The public needs to see the transition as a necessity, an unfortunate tragedy, rather than a scandal. Once the child is born and the trust is unlocked, we move. "And the friendship facade," Camille's voice followed, smooth and devoid of its usual professional deference. There was a sickening intimacy in her tone, a shared secret that made the skin on Isolde's arms crawl. "It served its purpose," Dominic replied. "Soon there won't be a need for facades. The contract will be fulfilled." Isolde's breath hitched in her throat. She pulled back into the shadows, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a panicked bird in a ribcage of bone. Her mind raced, trying to find a benign explanation. Perhaps they were talking about a business merger, a divestment of assets, but the way Camille's name sounded on Dominic's tongue, heavy with a familiarity that didn't belong to an employer, told a different story. She retreated to her dressing room, the air suddenly feeling thin. The royal sapphires sat on the velvet vanity tray like cold, unblinking blue eyes. She realized then that she wasn't being celebrated tonight. She was being curated for her own disposal. Every friendship Camille and Dominic had shared, the late-night strategy sessions, the shared glances across boardroom tables, the way Camille always seemed to know Dominic's mind better than his own wife, it all snapped into a terrifyingly clear picture. Camille wasn't the help, she was the successor. Isolde looked at her reflection. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. She had been so careful to be perfect. She had endured the isolation, the gaslighting, and the lonely nights, all for the sake of the family they were supposed to be building. And all the while, the man she loved had been drafting the fine print of her exit. The weight of the child kicked, a sharp, sudden movement that felt like a rallying cry. They didn't just want her gone, they wanted her legacy, her blood, and her silence. They wanted the baby to be a sterling asset, raised by a secretary who had already moved into the empty spaces of Isolde's life. As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed for noon, the sound echoing like a funeral knell through the hollow house, Isolde reached for the tuxedo jacket Dominic had left draped over a chair, intending to call the valet. That's when she felt the weight. A stiff corner of parchment tucked deep into the inner breast pocket, right against where his heart should have been. Her fingers shook as she pulled it out. It was a letter written on the Duke's private stationery. The first line was enough to make the room spin. The glass cage hadn't just been a prison, it had been a laboratory, and the experiment was over. Isolde gripped the paper, the ugly cry beginning to burn in the back of her throat, but she forced it down. If Dominic wanted a royal performance tonight, she would give him one, but it wouldn't be the one he had rehearsed. She wasn't just a wife anymore. She was a woman with 5 minutes of air left, and she was going to spend every second of it making sure he burned with her. The silence of the dressing room was thick, tasting of expensive powder and the metallic tang of unspoken dread. Isolde stood frozen, the Duke's tuxedo jacket draped over her arm like a shed skin. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the hand-painted wallpaper of the Sterling estate. To any outsider, this was the room of a woman who had everything. To Isolde, it was the site of an impending execution. Her fingers, pale and trembling, reached into the inner breast pocket once more. The parchment she had felt earlier, stiff, cold and heavy, slipped out. It was embossed with the Sterling family crest, a silver lion that seemed to sneer at her from the cream-colored header. She unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Dominic's. It was a sharp, aggressive script, the ink pressed so hard into the paper that the words felt like braille on the reverse side. It wasn't a business memo. It wasn't a diplomatic note. It was a love letter, not to her, but to the shadow that had been haunting their marriage for years. "My dearest Camille," the letter began. Isolde felt the air leave her lungs in one sharp, agonizing burst. The word "dearest" felt like a physical blow to her stomach. She had spent 10 years waiting for him to use a term of endearment that didn't sound like a rehearsed line from a play. "The countdown is nearly over. I know the mask has been heavy for you, playing the diligent assistant while watching me play the devoted husband. But the lawyers have confirmed the final clause today. The trust from my grandfather is ironclad. The inheritance only transfers in full upon the birth of a male heir, provided the marriage is intact at the time of delivery." Isolde's hand flew to her mouth, her teeth sinking into her knuckle to stop the scream. She looked down at the swell of her stomach, the life growing inside her that she had cherished as a miracle. To her, this pregnancy was the culmination of a decade of hope. To Dominic, it was a biological key to a vault. Once the heir is born and the legal contract is fulfilled, she will be discarded. I've already begun the paperwork to cite postpartum instability as grounds for full custody and a quiet annulment. She is fragile, Camille. It will be easy to convince the board and the press that she isn't fit for the sterling name. The estate, the title, and the future will finally be ours. Just a few more weeks of this charade. Wear the black dress tonight. I want to see our future standing in the shadows while I toast to the past. The paper rattled in Isolde's grip, the sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the clinical, cold-blooded efficiency of it. She wasn't a wife, she was a contractual obligation. She wasn't a partner, she was a biological necessity, a temporary vessel to be discarded like a used-up ink cartridge once the signature was dry. A wave of nausea rolled over her, followed by a searing, white-hot clarity. She looked at the vanity mirror, at the perfect Duchess staring back at her. Her face was contorted, the ugly cry finally breaking through the porcelain veneer. Tears carved tracks through her makeup, and a smear of red lipstick, the color of the anniversary, smudged across her jaw as she wiped her face in a frantic, desperate motion. "Discarded," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. She realized then that every close friendship Dominic had shared with Camille, every late-night meeting, every business trip, was a brick in the wall they were building to bury her alive. They didn't just want her gone, they wanted her child. They wanted to steal her motherhood and brand her insane so they could play house in the ruins of her dignity. The baby kicked, a sharp, violent movement that felt less like a flutter and more like a warning. Isolde's grief didn't vanish, but it hardened. It transformed from a liquid sorrow into a jagged, diamond-sharp resolve. She looked at the tuxedo jacket on the floor, at the letter in her hand, and then at the sterling sapphires glinting on the table. Dominic wanted a royal look for the anniversary dinner at El Eclat. He wanted her to stand there, radiant and pregnant, the perfect silent symbol of his impending wealth. He wanted a celebratory toast to 10 years of lies. "You want a show, Dominic?" Isolde said to her reflection, her voice no longer trembling. It was low, vibrating with a tectonic rage. "I will give you a performance the world will never forget." She didn't put the letter back. She didn't call her lawyer. She didn't run. Instead, she tucked the smoking gun into the hidden pocket of her red velvet gown. She reached for the sapphires, clasping the cold stones around her neck. They felt like a noose, but tonight she wouldn't be the one hanging. The golden age, aesthetic of their life, was about to meet its Great Depression. Isolde stood tall, clutching her stomach with one hand and her evidence with the other. She was 5 minutes from a medical collapse, her heart racing at a dangerous rhythm, but she had enough life left in her to set the kingdom on fire. As she walked out of the dressing room, her heels clicking against the marble like a countdown, she saw Camille standing at the end of the hall. The friend was already dressed in the minimalist black dress Dominic had requested, the shadow waiting to step into the light. Isolde didn't flinch. She gave Camille a small, terrifyingly serene smile. "Ready for the anniversary, Camille?" Isolde asked. "It's going to be a night for the history books." The air in the dressing room had grown cold, or perhaps it was just the ice now flowing through Isolde's veins. On the mannequin in the corner sat the dress Camille had suggested, a pale, shimmering champagne silk. It was a peacetime dress. It was soft, submissive, and blended perfectly into the neutral tones of the Sterling legacy. Isolde looked at it with a sneer. She reached past it, deep into the cedar-lined depths of the walk-in closet, and pulled out the garment she had ordered in secret months ago, but never had the courage to wear. It was a gown of deep red velvet, the color of vintage wine, of freshly spilled blood, of a heart that refused to stop beating. As she pulled the heavy fabric over her shoulders, the weight felt like armor. This wasn't just a dress, it was a declaration of war. The velvet was thick and unforgiving, molding to the curve of her advanced pregnancy, highlighting the very air Dominic viewed as a transaction. In the mirror, she looked less like a victim and more like a wound that had finally opened. She sat at her vanity, her hands surprisingly steady as she began her transformation. Usually she let the house staff do her makeup, but tonight she needed the intimacy of her own reflection. She applied a foundation that turned her skin into a pale porcelain mask. She lined her eyes in sharp, dark sweeps of kohl, creating a gaze that could cut through the dark. Finally, she reached for a lipstick titled Revenge Red. As she painted her lips, she thought of the medical evaluations Dominic mentioned in the letter. He wanted her to look unstable. He wanted her to look fragile. "I'll give you a scene, Dominic," she whispered to the glass, "but you won't be the one directing it." She reached for the sterling sapphires. The necklace was a masterpiece of Victorian craftsmanship, a series of heavy, deep blue stones surrounded by diamonds. They had been worn by 3 generations of sterling women, most of whom had died in this house, silent and forgotten. As she fastened the clasp, the cold metal sent a shiver through her. She wasn't just wearing jewelry, she was wearing the chains of the dynasty. Beside the jewelry box lay the letter. She picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper that had effectively ended her life 4 hours ago. She didn't hide it in her jewelry box. She didn't leave it for a lawyer. She folded it with surgical precision and slipped it into the hidden, silk-lined pocket of her crimson gown, right against her thigh, where she could feel it with every step. A sharp knock at the door made her heart lurch. "The car is waiting, Your Grace." It was Camille. Even through the wood of the door, her voice sounded like a serrated blade wrapped in velvet. "The Duke is growing impatient. He says the press is already gathering at El Eclat." Isolde stood up. Her back was straight, her chin tilted at an angle that would have made her father proud. She opened the door. Camille stood in the hallway, already dressed in the minimalist black gown Dominic had requested in his letter. She looked like a shadow, sharp, dark, and ready to consume. When her eyes fell on Isolde's red dress, her professional mask flickered for a fraction of a second. Her gaze traveled from the vibrant velvet to the cold sapphires at Isolde's throat. "That is a very bold choice for a Golden Age theme, Isolde," Camille said, her voice dropping an octave. Dominic was expecting the champagne silk. "The champagne was too quiet for tonight, Camille," Isolde replied, stepping past her. The scent of Camille's perfume, something sterile and expensive, cloyed at her lungs. "Tonight is about legacy, and red is the color of the sterling crest, isn't it?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked down the grand staircase, her heels clicking a rhythmic, military beat against the marble. At the bottom of the stairs, Dominic was waiting. He was the picture of aristocratic perfection in his tuxedo, his hair swept back, his posture commanding. He was checking his watch, his face a mask of mild irritation that immediately shifted into a practiced, charming smile as he looked up. But as his eyes took in the red gown, the smile faltered. He looked at her stomach, then her face, and for a fleeting second, his eyes darted to Camille, who was descending the stairs behind her. "Isolde," he said, his voice smooth but with a dangerous undercurrent. "You look striking, a bit much for your condition, perhaps. The doctor said you should be resting, not making a spectacle." "I feel more alive than I have in years, Dominic," she said, stepping toward him. She reached out and adjusted his bow tie, her fingers lingering just a second too long near his throat. "It's our anniversary. I wanted everyone to see exactly what you're celebrating tonight." Dominic's jaw tightened. He didn't like things he couldn't control, and the woman standing before him was no longer the docile ghost he had spent months gaslighting. "Let's go," he clipped out, offering his arm. As they walked toward the waiting limousine, the cold night air hit Isolde's face. She felt the letter in her pocket, a silent paper bomb waiting to go off. She looked at the dark windows of the estate, realizing she might never come back to this house as the woman who left it. The car door opened. Dominic slid in first, then Camille, taking her place as the assistant in the jump seat, her eyes never leaving Dominic's reflection in the glass. Isolde sat between them, the red velvet of her dress bunching against the black leather. The car pulled away, the gravel crunching under the tires like bone. The ride to the restaurant would take 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence. 20 minutes of breathing the same air as the two people who had planned to discard her like trash. Isolde closed her eyes and placed a hand on her stomach. Just 5 more minutes of strength, she told the life inside her. Just 5 minutes, and we'll both be free. The interior of El Eclat was a cavern of gold leaf, flickering candlelight, and the low, predatory hum of the city's elite. As the maitre d' led them to the center table, the throne, as the press called it, the room fell into a curated hush. Every head turned, the Duke in his shadow-black tuxedo, the secretary in her sharp, minimalist silhouette, and the Duchess, a vibrant, bleeding streak of crimson velvet in a sea of monochrome. Isolde felt the weight of the sterling sapphires pulling at her neck, like a collar designed to keep her head bowed. She sat heavily, her body aching with the literal weight of her pregnancy and the metaphorical weight of the letter pressed against her thigh. "You're pale, Isolde," Dominic remarked, his voice a low, honeyed warning. He signaled for the sommelier. "Perhaps a glass of sparkling water. We wouldn't want you fainting before the main course." "I've never felt more awake, Dominic," she replied, her eyes scanning the room. She could see the flickers of smartphone screens at the periphery. The vultures were waiting for a show. The appetizers arrived, oysters on beds of rock salt and tuna tartare garnished with gold leaf. It was food that required precision, small movements, and a lack of appetite. Isolde watched as Dominic picked up his fork, his movements fluid and arrogant. Across the table, Camille sat with her back perfectly straight. She didn't look like an employee, she looked like a queen in waiting. Her eyes darted toward Dominic, a brief fraction of a second contact that carried the weight of 1,000 secret nights. It was a glance of ownership. Camille reached for her water glass, and as she did, her fingers brushed the cuff of Dominic's jacket, a gesture so subtle most would miss it, but to Isolde, it was a brand. A sharp, violent kick blossomed against Isolde's ribs. She winced, her hand flying to the swell of her stomach. "Is something wrong?" Camille asked, her voice tilting into a pitch of performative concern. "The baby." "He's restless," Isolde said, looking Camille directly in the eye. "He can tell when the air in the room is stale. He knows when something is misplaced." Dominic's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, the candlelight dancing in his pupils like twin fires. "Isolde, you're being cryptic. It's unrefined. Camille has spent weeks ensuring tonight is perfect. The least you could do is show some gratitude." "Oh, I am grateful, Camille," Isolde said, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of the neighboring table. "I'm grateful for your dedication. I've realized lately just how much work you've put into this family, into our future." The silence at the table became a physical thing, a cold, dense fog. Camille's mask of professional indifference didn't slip, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped her linen napkin. Dominic's hand reached across the table, not to comfort Isolde, but to squeeze her wrist with a pressure that was just short of painful. "That's enough," he hissed. His smile remained fixed for the cameras, but his eyes were black with rage. "You are tired. The hormones are making you imaginative. We are here to celebrate 10 years of a perfect union. Do not ruin the narrative." The narrative, that was all she was to him. A character in a story written by him and edited by Camille. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if trying to break through the velvet cage. Isolde felt a surge of nausea, but it wasn't from the food. It was the smell of them, Dominic's expensive sandalwood mixed with the sterile citrus scent of Camille's perfume. It was the smell of a conspiracy. She looked at the oyster on her plate, cold and grey. She thought of the letter. She will be discarded. She could see them now in her mind's eye, Dominic and Camille, months from now, sitting at this very table, celebrating her unfortunate breakdown, while her son was tucked away in a nursery, being raised by the woman who helped orchestrate his mother's ruin. The appetizers were excellent, weren't they? Dominic said, his tone shifting back to the jovial, public duke as the waiter approached to clear the plates. He looked at Camille and gave her a nod, a signal. Camille stood up, smoothing her black dress. "I'll go check on the delivery of the anniversary gift," she said, her voice silk, "and I'll ensure the press has the correct quotes for the toast." As Camille walked away, her hips swaying with a confidence that felt like a victory lap, Dominic leaned back, looking at Isolde with a mixture of pity and contempt. "You look like you're about to break, Isolde," he whispered. "Maybe we should leave after the toast. I'll call the doctor. You need a long rest, a very long one." Isolde felt the adrenaline spike, a hot, electric current that pushed back the fatigue. She reached into her pocket and felt the crisp edge of the parchment. "You're right, Dominic," she said, picking up her wine glass, filled only with water, and swirling it. "I am tired of resting. I think it's time I finally stood up." The main course was being served, but the Last Supper was over. The stage was set, the audience was watching, and the Duke was about to find out that his fragile wife had learned how to play the lead. The air in El Eclat grew heavy, pressurized by the expectant silence of 100 socialites. The main course sat untouched, the steam from the herb-crusted lamb rising like incense in a temple of greed. Dominic stood, adjusting his cufflinks with the effortless grace of a man who believed he owned the very ground he stood upon. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute, the ring of metal on glass cutting through the low murmur of the restaurant like a guillotine's blade. "Friends, colleagues, and distinguished guests," Dominic began, his voice a rich baritone that projected warmth while his eyes remained as cold as flint. 10 years ago I made a vow, to protect, to cherish, and to build a legacy. Tonight, as we stand on the precipice of a new generation for the sterling name, I toast to the woman who has been by my side, to Isolde, my wife, the mother of my heir." He raised his glass, his eyes flicking toward Camille, who stood near the velvet curtains of the kitchen entrance. She gave him a microscopic nod, the signal to proceed with the narrative of her instability. But the applause didn't come. Isolde stood. She didn't rise with the weary heavy-heartedness of a pregnant woman. She rose with the terrifying verticality of a ghost returning to haunt its killer. The red velvet of her gown seemed to drink in the candlelight, making her appear as though she was standing in a pool of shadow and blood. Her hand, steady as a marksman's, reached into her pocket. "Dominic," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a jagged, crystalline quality that made the sommelier stop mid-pour 3 tables away. "You've always been so fond of speeches, but your best writing was never meant for the public, was it?" The Duke's smile didn't fall, it stiffened, turning into a waxen mask of confusion. "Isolde, sit down, you're overexcited. The doctor warned us about your nerves." "The doctor warned me about my heart, Dominic. He didn't warn me about yours," she replied. She pulled the cream-colored parchment from her dress. The silver sterling lion on the header caught the light, gleaming like a bared tooth. Across the room, Camille's face drained of color. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out as if she could pluck the air itself and silence the room. Isolde didn't look at her. She looked at the woman at the next table, a prominent journalist for the London Times, who had already begun recording on her phone. Isolde unfolded the letter. "My dearest Camille," Isolde began. The name hit the room like a physical shock. A collective gasp rippled through the elite, a sound like a sudden intake of breath before a plunge. Dominic's hand, still holding the vintage Merlot, began to tremor. "The countdown is nearly over," Isolde continued, her voice gaining strength, echoing off the gold leaf ceiling. The inheritance only transfers in full upon the birth of a male heir. Once the heir is born and the legal contract is fulfilled, she will be discarded. Isolde, stop this madness, Dominic roared, his aristocratic composure finally cracking. He lunged across the table, his fingers clawing for the paper, but his movement was clumsy, fueled by a primal, cornered animal panic. His hand struck his wine glass. In slow motion, the crystal flute tipped. The deep red liquid erupted into the air, a mid-air explosion of Merlot that sprayed across the white linen tablecloth and splattered against the Duke's pristine white shirt. The glass hit the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot, shattering into 1,000 diamonds. Isolde didn't flinch as the wine stained her own gown. The red on red was invisible. She kept reading, her eyes burning with a vengeful light. I've already begun the paperwork to cite postpartum instability. The estate, the title, and the future will finally be ours. I count the days until I no longer have to pretend to love a ghost. She finished the last word and let the letter flutter from her fingers. It landed in the center of the table, soaking up the spilled wine, the ink beginning to bleed like a fresh wound. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum. Dominic stood with his mouth agape, his chest heaving, his expensive suit ruined by the dark red stain that looked exactly like a chest wound. He looked small, he looked caught, he looked common. In the shadows, Camille had her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting toward the exits. The shadow was finally in the light, and she found it blinding. She wasn't the secret queen anymore, she was the accomplice to a moral homicide. Isolde leaned over the table, her face inches from Dominic's. The ugly cry was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying serenity. The air is fine, Dominic, she whispered, loud enough for the recording phones to catch every syllable. But the contract is dead, and so is the Duke of Stirling. She turned, her red velvet train sweeping over the shards of glass. She didn't look back at the man who had called her a nuisance. She didn't look at the woman who had tried to steal her life. She walked toward the exit, her head held higher than any crown could ever force it. She had been 5 minutes from collapse when she entered the restaurant, but as she pushed through the heavy oak doors and felt the cold night air hit her face, Isolde Stirling realized she had never felt more alive. Behind her, the sound of the press descending on the table was the sweetest music she had ever heard. The Stirling dynasty hadn't just imploded, it had been read its last rites in front of the world. The aftermath of the shattered glass was not a silence of peace, but a silence of shock. In the center of El Eclat, the air was thick with the ozone of a ruined reputation. Dominic stood paralyzed, the red wine on his shirt beginning to dry into a dark, ugly crust. But while the Duke was a statue of defeat, Camille Laurent was a flurry of calculated motion. She moved from the curtains with a grace that was now frantic. Her hands were trembling, perhaps for the first time in her career, as she rushed to Dominic's side. Dominic, oh heavens, Isolde, what have you done? Camille's voice was a masterpiece of performative tragedy. She reached for a linen napkin, dabbing at the wine on Dominic's chest as if she were a concerned subordinate witnessing a mental breakdown. She looked around at the dining room, her eyes wide, glistening with forced tears. Can't you see she's unwell? Someone call a doctor. The pregnancy, it's caused some kind of psychotic break. This letter, it's a forgery. It must be. It was a brilliant play. Even in the face of total exposure, Camille was attempting to re-establish the narrative. If she could frame the reading as a symptom of instability, she could still save the Duke's custody claim. She could still save herself. Isolde, who had stopped just a few feet from the exit, turned back slowly. She didn't look like a woman in the throes of a breakdown. She looked like a woman who had just stepped out of a cold, refreshing bath. Still working for the firm, Camille? Isolde's voice was calm, cutting through Camille's frantic chatter like a diamond through glass. Still trying to tidy up the mess. You really are a dedicated friend. Isolde, please, Camille sobbed, a single tear finally rolling down her cheek. You're hurting your husband, you're hurting the baby. Let me take you home. We can talk about this privately. Camille reached out, her hand extending toward Isolde in a gesture of false comfort. But as she stepped into the direct light of the chandelier, The shadow look was gone. Without the Duke's protection, her minimalist black dress looked like what it truly was, the uniform of an intruder. Isolde didn't flinch. She leaned back against the mahogany door frame, her hand resting protectively over the heir Dominic so desperately wanted to treat as a pawn. There is no privately anymore, Camille, and there is no forged letter. Isolde reached into her small clutch and pulled out her smartphone. She held the screen up, not for Dominic, but for the entire room to see. You see, while you were choosing that dress and planning my medical evaluation, I was busy with a few evaluations of my own. I didn't just find the letter, Camille, I scanned it. Dominic's head snapped up. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, tracked the phone in Isolde's hand. The high-resolution scan to the editorial boards of the London Times, the Chronicle, and the Associated Press exactly 5 minutes before I stood up for that toast, Isolde said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the deathly quiet room. The digital forensic trail is already being verified. By the time we leave this restaurant, the contract will be the front-page story of the morning edition. Every word, every signature, every mention of your name, Camille. The performative tears on Camille's face dried instantly. Her features didn't crumble, they hardened. The mask of the concerned friend slipped away, revealing the cold, predatory architect underneath. Her hand, which had been dabbing at Dominic's shirt, fell to her side. She looked at Dominic, not with love or loyalty, but with the sharp, panicked calculation of a rat realizing the ship had already sunk. You stupid girl," Camille hissed, the velvet gone from her voice, replaced by a jagged, guttural bitterness. "You've destroyed the sterling name. You've destroyed your child's inheritance. Do you think the world will embrace you for this? You've made yourself a pariah." "I was already a pariah in my own home, Camille," Isolde replied. "I was a ghost and a nuisance, remember? I'd rather be a pariah with my soul intact than a duchess in a cage built by you." Dominic finally found his voice, though it was a hollow, broken thing. "Isolde, the press, call them, tell them it's a mistake. I'll give you anything. The estate in Scotland, the trust, I'll rewrite it all." "You already wrote it, Dominic," Isolde said, turning her back on them for the final time. "And unlike you, I think the public deserves to read the truth." Outside, the first flashbulbs of the paparazzi began to pop against the restaurant windows like heat lightning. The shadow was no longer just exposed, it was being burned away. Camille looked toward the kitchen exit, her mind clearly racing toward a way to disappear before the police arrived to question the Duke about the medical evaluations he had illegally commissioned. Isolde pushed open the heavy oak doors. As the cameras flared, she didn't hide her face. She stood in her red velvet gown, her tear-stained face radiant in the light of the truth. Behind her, in the middle of the gold-leaf dining room, the Duke and his friend stood alone among the shards of glass and the smell of sour wine, two villains who had forgotten that in every story, the ghost eventually finds a way to speak. The doors of El Eclat swung shut behind Isolde, muffling the roar of the elite crowd, but the silence of the night was short-lived. A wall of white light hit her instantly. The paparazzi, tipped off by her BCC'd emails, were a pack of wolves sensing blood in the water. Flashbulbs strobed like lightning, turning the street into a jagged, monochrome nightmare. "Isolde, look this way. Your Grace, is it true? Is the marriage a contract? Is the Duke inside?" Isolde didn't answer. She couldn't. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the reading, the fierce, electric fire that had allowed her to stand against Dominic, was evaporating, leaving behind a cold, hollow vacuum. Her legs felt like they were made of water. The weight of the red velvet gown, once her armor, now felt like a leaden weight dragging her toward the pavement. She took one step, then another, her hand white-knuckled as she gripped the stone railing of the restaurant's portico. Then a sharp, searing pain bloomed in her abdomen, not a kick this time, but a tight, crushing squeeze that stole her breath. "Oh," she gasped, her knees finally buckling. The world tilted. The black asphalt rose up to meet her, but before she hit the ground, a pair of strong arms caught her. It wasn't the sandalwood scent of Dominic. It was the smell of rain and motor oil. It was her driver, Marcus, the only man in the Sterling employ who had looked at her with pity rather than calculation over the last year. "I've got you, Your Grace," he whispered, shielding her face from the cameras with his coat. "The car is running. We're leaving now." He lifted her, her red dress spilling over his arms like a waterfall of blood. He shoved through the throng of photographers, his shoulder acting as a battering ram. Behind them, the restaurant doors burst open again. Dominic appeared, looking like a man who had escaped a burning building only to find the fire department was there to arrest him. He tried to shout her name, but his voice was drowned out by the shouting press. They swarmed him, their lenses inches from his wine-stained shirt, their questions a barrage of accusations. Marcus threw Isolde into the back of the sleek black limousine and dived into the driver's seat. The tires screeched, smoking against the pavement as the car lunged forward, clipping a reporter's tripod and disappearing into the London fog. Inside the car, the world was a blur of streetlights and shadows. Isolde lay across the leather bench, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The medical stakes the doctor had warned her about were no longer a distant threat. They were a physical reality. Her heart was racing at a dangerous, fluttering rhythm, supraventricular tachycardia, the doctor had called it, a heart that couldn't keep up with the soul's trauma. "Marcus," she wheezed, clutching her stomach. "The hospital, St. Jude, hurry." "I'm driving as fast as I can, ma'am," he replied, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "The press, they're following us, 3 cars, maybe 4. Isolde looked out the rear window. The predatory glare of headlights pursued them through the mist. They didn't care that she was in pain. They wanted the photo of the broken Duchess at the emergency room doors. They wanted the final shot of the scandal. Another contraction rippled through her, more intense than the last. She closed her eyes, trying to find the serenity she had felt in the restaurant, but it was gone. In its place was a primal fear for the life inside her. "I did it for you," she thought, her hand trembling against her belly. "I broke the cage so you wouldn't be born in it. Please stay just a little longer." She pulled her phone from her clutch. The screen was a chaotic mess of notifications. The letter was everywhere. Headlines were already screaming across social media. The Sterling scandal, discarded Duchess SBAKS. Underneath, a grainy photo of Dominic with the wine stain on his chest was already going viral, labeled with the caption, "The Mark of Cain." She felt a grim sense of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. Her vision began to gray at the edges. The sounds of the city, the sirens, the honking, the rain, began to recede into a dull, underwater hum. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. If I don't, make sure the lawyers get the scan, don't let him take the baby." "You're going to be fine, Isolde," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "We're 2 minutes out, look at the lights, we're almost there." The limousine swerved, taking a corner on 2 wheels, and suddenly the bright, sterile canopy of the emergency entrance loomed ahead. Marcus didn't wait for the car to fully stop before he leaped out, shouting for a gurney. As the hospital doors whistled open, a swarm of nurses in blue scrubs rushed out. Isolde felt herself being lifted, the cool night air hitting her face one last time before the artificial warmth of the hospital swallowed her. The ceiling lights passed over her like rhythmic pulses of white fire. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the reflection in the glass doors. A woman in a tattered red dress, surrounded by healers, while in the distance, the flashing lights of the pursuing press were blocked by the hospital's security gates. She had escaped the Duke, she had escaped the shadow, now she just had to survive the night. The ICU waiting room at St. Jude's smelled of floor wax and desperate prayers, a stark contrast to the scent of lilies and betrayal at El Eclat. Dominic Sterling paced the linoleum floor, his movements no longer those of a duke, but of a caged animal. He had managed to bypass the initial security surge by throwing his title around like a blunt instrument, but he hadn't yet been allowed past the heavy double doors where Isolde lay fighting for her life and the life of his heir. He stopped in front of a wall-mounted television, which was muted but screaming in bold, red tickers, "Sterling Dynasty in Crisis," the discarded letter VRFID. "It's not possible," he hissed, his fingers digging into his palms. "She's a housewife. She's a pregnant, emotional wreck. She shouldn't have been able to coordinate this." Standing in the corner, Camille Laurent was silent. She was no longer dabbing at his wine-stained shirt. She stood near the exit, her coat clutched tightly around her, her eyes fixed on her phone. The shadow was looking for a door. "Camille," Dominic barked, turning to her, "call Dr. Aris. Now, I want a signed statement on his letterhead by dawn. He needs to testify that Isolde has been suffering from prenatal psychosis. We'll say the letter was a therapeutic exercise she took out of context, a creative writing piece to deal with her paranoia. We'll claim she's been hallucinating the affair." Camille didn't move. She didn't even look up. "Dominic, the forensic digital trail is already public. The journalists have the metadata. They know that letter was drafted on your private server 3 months ago." "I don't care about the metadata," Dominic shouted, his voice echoing off the sterile walls and drawing the sharp glare of a passing nurse. "I am the Duke of Sterling. My word carries more weight than a timestamp. If we can prove she's delusional, the letter becomes the product of a broken mind. We can suppress the publication, we can seize her devices, and we can move her to the private wing in Switzerland before she even wakes up." He stepped toward her, his eyes wild with the frantic energy of a man trying to hold back a landslide with his bare hands. "You're the one who found the doctor, Camille. You're the one who said we could frame the instability. Do your job." Camille finally looked at him. The performative shock from the restaurant was long gone, replaced by a cold, clinical detachment that made her look more like a stranger than a lover. "I did my job, Dominic," she said, her voice terrifyingly flat. "My job was to ensure the Sterling legacy survived, but you let a nuisance outplay you in front of the entire world. You dropped the glass. You stood there like a fool while she read your private thoughts to the very people who fund your charities." "I was blindsided." "No," Camille corrected him, stepping back as he tried to reach for her. "You were arrogant. You thought she was a ghost, so you forgot to check if she was still breathing." Dominic's face contorted. "We are in this together, Camille. If I go down, you're the other woman. You're the secretary who plotted to displace a pregnant duchess. Your career is over. Your reputation is ash." A small, sharp smile touched Camille's lips, a predator's smile. "That's where you're wrong, Dominic. I've spent 10 years being invisible, and I've learned how to stay that way. While you were packing this floor, I was speaking to my own legal counsel." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small tablet, sliding a document across the screen. "This is a sworn affidavit. I've already sent a draft to the Associated Press. In it, I state that I was under extreme professional duress. I claim that I was a victim of your unpredictable temperament and that I only followed your orders regarding the medical evaluations because I feared for my safety and my livelihood." Dominic froze. The air in the room seemed to turn to ice. "You're betraying me after everything I promised you." "You promised me an empire, Dominic. All I see is a sinking ship," Camille said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "I'm not the friend who stays until the end. I'm the survivor who knows when to jump. I've already resigned, effective immediately. I've also provided the press with a few choice emails where you expressed, let's call it distaste for the board of directors. If you're going to be a pariah, you're going to do it alone." She turned toward the exit, her heels clicking a final, dismissive rhythm against the linoleum. "Camille, you can't leave me," Dominic yelled, taking a step toward her. "Watch me," she replied without looking back. As the sliding glass doors hissed open for her, a group of hospital security guards stepped into the hallway, blocking Dominic's path. "Lord Sterling," the lead guard said, his voice firm and devoid of the usual deference Dominic commanded. "The Duchess's medical proxy has arrived. Per her explicit instructions and the emergency restraining order filed by her attorneys 30 minutes ago, you are to be escorted from the premises immediately." "Medical proxy, she's unconscious," Dominic roared. "She wasn't unconscious when she arrived, Your Grace," the guard replied, gesturing toward the exit. "She had everything ready, including her signature." Dominic looked through the glass doors. Camille was already gone, disappearing into the dark London rain. He looked back toward the ICU, where the red velvet gown he had mocked was now being cut away by doctors to save a life he had tried to discard. He was the Duke of Sterling, a man of power, wealth, and history. But as the guards took his arms to lead him out into the swarm of cameras waiting at the gates, he realized he was something else entirely. He was a memory, and the ghost was finally in charge of the house. The High Court of Justice was a cathedral of cold stone and unforgiving echoes. In the center of the wood-paneled room, under the watchful gaze of the royal coat of arms, the Sterling dynasty was finally being weighed and found wanting. Isolde sat at the plaintiff's table 6 weeks after the night at El Eclat. She was no longer dressed in the war paint of crimson velvet. Today she wore a sharp navy blue tailored suit, the color of a deep, calm ocean. Her posture was iron-backed, her face pale but luminous. Beside her, in a small, portable bassinet, lay the heir, Arthur Dominic Sterling, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the fact that his arrival had been the catalyst for his father's ruin. Across the aisle, Dominic Sterling looked like a ghost of the man he had once been. Without the perfection of his office, without Camille's meticulous management, and without the shield of his reputation, he appeared gaunt. His suit, though still expensive, seemed to hang off a frame weakened by scandal. He didn't look like a duke, he looked like a defendant. The judge, a woman with eyes like flint, looked down at the final documents. "The evidence provided," the judge began, her voice ringing through the hushed courtroom, including the verified digital correspondence between the defendant and his former associate, Ms. Laurent, establishes a clear and malicious intent to commit fraud, emotional abuse, and the systematic subversion of the plaintiff's civil liberties. The plan to use a state of pregnancy as a weapon for discarding a spouse is not merely a moral failing, it is a criminal conspiracy. Dominic's lawyer stood up, his voice lacking conviction. "Your Honor, my client was under immense pressure to secure the Sterling Trust." "The Sterling Trust," the judge interrupted, her gavel hovering, "was built on the premise of a stable and honorable union, by your client's own admission in these letters. That union was a curated lie." The judge turned her gaze to Isolde. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The marriage is dissolved on grounds of extreme cruelty and fraud. Per the emergency motion, the Sterling Trust will be placed in a protective conservatorship for the minor heir, with the plaintiff, Isolde Sterling, acting as the sole trustee. Dominic Sterling is hereby stripped of his administrative control over the estate and is granted limited, supervised visitation only upon completion of a court-mandated psychiatric evaluation." A soft, collective gasp filled the gallery. It was a total victory. Dominic's face turned a violent shade of purple. He surged to his feet, his hands slamming against the table. "You can't do this. That is my name. That is my blood. She's nothing. She was a nobody until I gave her that ring." "The ring was a shackle, Dominic," Isolde said, her voice calm and steady, cutting through his rage like a cooling wind. "She didn't stand up. She didn't need to. She held the power now. And as for being a nobody, I was the one who managed the estate's books while you were working with Camille. I was the one who kept the board members happy while you were insulting them behind their backs. I wasn't just the Duchess. I was the bridge, and I've decided to burn it." The judge hammered the gavel once, a sound like a thunderclap. "Order, bailiffs, remove the defendant." As the officers took Dominic's arms, he looked at his son, the child he had viewed as a contractual obligation. For the first time, he didn't see an asset. He saw a stranger. He was led out of the courtroom, his shouts fading into the hallway, leaving behind nothing but the red stains of a ruined legacy and the silence of his own making. Isolde stood up slowly. She picked up the bassinet, looking down at Arthur's tiny, sleeping face. She felt a lightness in her chest that she hadn't felt in 10 years. The golden cage was open. As she walked out of the courtroom, the doors swung open to a different kind of light than the one at the restaurant. It was the soft, honest glow of a London morning. The press was there, but Marcus, now her private head of security, had already cleared a path. She stopped at the top of the stone steps. A reporter shouted from the back, "Isolde, how does it feel to be the sovereign mother of the Sterling estate?" Isolde looked out at the city, her chin tilted high. "It feels," she said, her voice clear enough for every camera to catch, "like the first day of my life." The story of the Sterling scandal concludes not with a whimper, but with a transformation. Isolde Sterling did more than just survive a betrayal. She dismantled an empire of lies and rebuilt it on a foundation of truth. In the glass-walled offices of the Sterling Foundation, the name on the door hasn't changed, but but the heart behind it has. Dominic remains a social pariah, his name a cautionary tale in every boardroom, while Camille Laurent has vanished into the obscurity she so richly deserves. The narrator provides a final reflection. History is often written by those who seek to silence others, but destiny belongs to those who find their voice. It highlights that a friend who helps you betray your family is a friend who will eventually betray you. As Isolde proved, the most powerful thing a woman can do when she is told she is fragile is to prove she is unbreakable. If you cheered for Isolde's final victory in that courtroom, give this video a thumbs up. Did Dominic get what he deserved, or was his punishment too light? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell icon to join our community of storytellers, because remember, the truth always has a way of coming out, especially when it's written in a letter.